One of the honestly most confusing takes I see all the time is that politics in Star Wars used to be this different, universal thing, where there were broad principles rather than any, quote, in-your-face contemporary references to events, issues, or people. George Lucas is many things, but subtle is not one of those, and outspoken about his beliefs very much is. So we're going to be looking through the prequels, starting today with The Phantom Menace, at some of the biggest references to those issues, peoples, and events which were very obvious at the time, though which may be less obvious in retrospect, particularly to people who were younger and less aware of what George and others involved in making the trilogy may have been getting at. Because the point is to keep this as on the nose as possible, the focus is going to be on very clear either in-text references or to things which George himself pointed out as being references or allegory in interviews or in directions he gave when making the movie. The Phantom Menace was written in the mid to late 1990s, leading up to its 1990 release, so while it lacked the context of 9/11, the War on Terror, and the Bush administration which so heavily informed the next two prequels, there was still plenty for George to manage to squeeze in. Probably the most prominent examples can be seen just by looking at character names like that of Viceroy Newt Gunray of the Trade Federation and Trade Federation Senator Lot Dodd. In the case of the former, Lucas had combined two of the most prominent Republican politicians of the time to come up with this name. Newt was a very obvious reference to Newt Gingrich, who became Speaker of the House in 1995 after the Republicans won both the House and the Senate in the midterm elections of 1994, elections which took place within a week of when George Lucas was starting to write The Phantom Menace, which we'll get back to in a moment. The Gunray part, while helpfully keeping the Newt G initials, is pretty much just swapping the syllables in President Ronald Reagan's last name, from Reagan to Gunray. There's a story that's pretty commonly presented as George Lucas suing Ronald Reagan for using the name Star Wars with his Strategic Defense Initiative in the 80s, but that isn't quite correct considering Reagan wasn't the one who used the label, and he had mixed feelings about it being used himself, though Lucas did strongly object to Star Wars being associated with the SDI in any way, and he sued basically anyone on either side of the issue who used the name. I've done a separate video on that already though. But in effect, what Lucas had done was like if a current Star Wars villain were named Kevin Umptrue or Nancy Idenbama or something, or if they got really weird and named it like and subscribe for more videos from Corey's datapad for some reason. Lot Dodd is probably the less prominent of these two examples, especially as we get farther away from the 90s. Newt Gingrich and Ronald Reagan remain pretty widely known people, but Trent Lott, one of Lot Dodd's two namesakes, isn't someone who comes up much anymore. Trent Lott first entered Congress as a Republican in the 1972 elections, riding the massive wave of Republican victories in Richard Nixon's re-election, who George has repeatedly mentioned as being the inspiration for Palpatine, saying in 1981, quote, Anakin Skywalker began hanging out with the Emperor, who at that point nobody knew was that bad because he was an elected official. He was a politician, Richard M. Nixon was his name. He subverted the Senate and finally took over and was really evil, end quote. Those inspirations are very subtle. Those inspirations remain, though they get much more centered around the Bush administration, particularly Dick Cheney, as the prequels go on. But for Trent Lott, he became far more relevant in the same 1994 midterm elections, which brought Gingrich into the House Speaker position. Gingrich became the Speaker of the House, and Lott became the Senate Majority Whip, which is basically a position responsible for making sure the votes within a party go a specific way on specific topics. And then in 96, he became the leader of the Senate Republican Conference, basically meaning he was the 90s Mitch McConnell. A big part of the Republican platform leading up to their victory was called the Contract with America, authored by Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey, a member of the House of Representatives who became House Majority Leader after the election, based on ideas from organizations like the Heritage Foundation, and much of the debate around this was centered on things like shrinking the federal government and deregulation, which are at least the things that are most relevant for what George was talking about in The Phantom Menace. George had this to say to Paul Duncan for the book The Star Wars Archives, quote, The film starts with corrupt corporations doing things behind people's backs. A corporation is a shark without a conscience. All it cares about is eating. It's not responsible, it's the stakeholders' fault, or the CEO's fault, or the board's fault. It's always somebody else's fault. But of course the golden rule is to make money no matter what, end quote. The Trade Federation is the entity representing this in the movie, and the names, not coincidentally, are sourced by George from some of the most prominent Republican politicians of the time. But this isn't an entirely partisan commentary. We've talked about the Lot in Lot Dodd, but the Dodd most likely comes from the name of Senator Chris Dodd, who in 1995 also became the chair of the Democratic National Committee. Lucas repeatedly commented on his opposition to capitalism and corporate interests ruling politics, so while he primarily held Republicans responsible, at least on a basic read of what he's doing in these movies, he was also expressing frustration at Democrats for varying degrees of either ineffectuality or complicity in these problems. He also loops this into the themes he says he's setting up with the symbiont circle of life and midichlorians, the Gungans and the Naboo, and all of the other pairs in the movie which represent how everything is interconnected, saying, quote, "The senators are more interested in themselves than in helping each other. They've fallen out of the symbiotic circle. They couldn't agree on anything because their interests became too divergent, so they couldn't get anything done as a republic, and the Chancellor uses this division, which he helped create, to become the Emperor." So again, while most of his ire was clearly directed towards one party, it wasn't something that he was clearing the other party of responsibility for either. The strategy of naming characters like this after real events, people, or corporations does come up again in the future, though in an area where George's involvement in the choice is a bit less clear, although clearly it was still something aligning with his views, when the Kaminoan senator named Halle Bertoni was pushing for her planet's economic interests over the well-being of the galaxy, a reference to the fracking of the Halliburton Corporation. George had his own thoughts on environmentalism and how he was reflecting it in his movies that we'll get to a bit later on though too. Another area where the characters were set up with a real-world political reference in mind didn't make it into the character's name, because I guess even George Lucas had limits on how on the nose you can be, but they did make it into his guidance for the actors, and it might have been something that he thought of more over time as he made the movie. Chancellor Valorum, the outgoing chancellor who's brought down by the vote of no confidence, was played by Terence Stamp, who recalled George summarizing Valorum's character to him by saying, quote, "He's a good man but beleaguered, a bit like President Clinton when asked for direction." Notably though, this beleaguerment did not refer to Clinton's own impeachment, as that did not happen until significantly after the filming was over for The Phantom Menace. These obvious political themes went beyond oblique or overt references to individuals and into the realm of issues that weren't just corporate greed or political corruption. You could point to the issues of inequality and slavery on Tatooine and the limits of the Republic's ability or willingness to do anything, but that's probably a few steps below how overt we're trying to stay with this, since I want to focus on areas where George Lucas himself set an explicit parallel between either one character and a real-life individual, or one issue in the movie and a real-life specific issue. There's a broader sense in which he says the movie is influenced by the interconnectivity we talked about already with the symbiont circle, with George also saying, quote, "We're getting a lot of greedy people and isolationists and nativists and xenophobes who say, 'I don't want to be with those people. That stuff has to fall away,'" end quote. But he also gets into an even more specific example than that in his conversation with Paul Duncan for the archives, global warming and environmentalism, which we brought up with Halle Bertoni earlier. Part of what he's representing with Naboo and the Gungans is a need for humans to see themselves as part of the ecosystem, something Obi-Wan calls out explicitly in the film.
"What happens to one of you will affect the other. You must understand this."
Lucas claims that while global warming may not destroy the planet per se, it would destroy humankind, and humans have to either adapt or migrate, with Duncan's implying that, quote, "The Gungans and Naboo have to make this decision about how to survive and save their planet. The only way to save the planet is by them joining together and cooperating." So on the one hand, it's true, when George is setting up these political ideas, there's a certain universality he's addressing or trying to address with the overall concepts. But the idea that these concepts were in any way divorced from specific examples in contemporary politics is simply untrue, and George Lucas would probably not be happy with the suggestion that he tried to keep those out. That's also why you can see some of these ideas shifting over time, like with the transition from Palpatine as a Nixon surrogate to his actions being meant by George to reflect the more immediate feelings Lucas had about President Bush and Vice President Cheney in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. I think you can maybe even see an example of this shift in how George even talks about The Phantom Menace. By the time the Star Wars archives for Episode 1, 2, and 3 were out in 2020, global warming had become the most visible environmentally related issue. But in the 80s and mid to late 90s, then the ozone layer would have been another very important topic and something that often got wrapped in with global warming. So even depending on when George is giving these interviews, his answers on what exactly he was talking about might shift a bit with the context of issues that he cares about. Although Trent Lott's name was never not Trent Lott. The farther you get from the time something was made, the more of these very relevant contemporary references may fall into obscurity, but these are very much the kinds of things that would have been known and relevant at the time that these movies were created. Any piece of media is always going to have some of the hallmarks of the time it was created, whether they think they're being overtly political or not. But in George's case, these were very intentional references, and they were set up for a reason. That's going to do it for today though. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.